We begin in Washington, where Israel's Prime Minister has just addressed a joint session of Congress. Benjamin Netanyahu delivered a passionate defense of his country's war in Gaza, 9 months after a deadly attack by Hamas killed 1,400 people. Netanyahu denounced protesters for calling for an end to that war. He accused Iran and others of funding and promoting anti-Israel propaganda.
The outrageous slanders that paint Israel as racist and genocidal are meant to delegitimize Israel, to demonize the Jewish state, and to demonize Jews everywhere. And no wonder we've witnessed an appalling rise of anti-Semitism in America and around the world. My friends, whenever and wherever we see the scourge of anti-Semitism, we must unequivocally condemn it and resolutely fight it, without exception.
Netanyahu was invited to speak by Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson. For some lawmakers, it was an unwelcome visit. A number of Democrats boycotted the event, with the Biden administration also facing pressure to help end the war in Gaza. The CBC's Ellen Morrow is in Washington monitoring the Prime Minister's remarks and the reaction. So, Ellen, what have been the big takeaways from this speech?
Well, Andrew, Benjamin Netanyahu is still speaking there on Capitol Hill, but this speech has been about Netanyahu being on the defensive, about trying to make the case, trying to push back against the fierce criticism that Israel has received over the past 9 months over its conduct of the war in Gaza. And we heard Netanyahu try to make that case in several ways. He made a point that he's made throughout the war, trying to tie Israel's fight against Hamas in Gaza to a larger clash of civilizations, pointing to Hamas being a proxy of Iran and Iran being an enemy of the United States as well as Israel. Again, that's an argument he has made throughout this conflict. We also saw him spend a lot of time talking about the October 7th attacks in graphic detail, comparing those attacks on a population basis to 9/11. He also spoke about the hostages, and there were several standing ovations as he talked about the hostages, dozens of whom still remain in Gaza. Noah Argamani, who was a hostage rescued by Israeli soldiers, was there in the gallery and received a standing ovation. He then went on to try to put a bit of a human face on Israeli soldiers. There are several of them there in the gallery. Netanyahu going through some of their individual stories. The Israel Defense Forces have received so much criticism, as well as Netanyahu, throughout these past 9 months about how this war in Gaza has gone down, and more than 37,000 Palestinians killed, according to the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza. But Netanyahu trying to humanize those soldiers. He also spent a lot of time talking about the widespread protests that have happened in the U.S. They've happened in Canada as well, obviously, against the war in Gaza, telling protesters they should be ashamed of themselves, saying that they're funded by Iran, calling them Iran's useful idiot. And we'll get to those protests in just a second, Andrew. And Netanyahu also talked about trying to reach a deal to bring back the hostages, saying that he feels like there has been progress that's been made, but he also said that there still needs to be total victory against Hamas. So that does not really give you any sense of where the efforts to actually get a ceasefire. There have been so much pressure on these efforts to get a ceasefire. You know, we really didn't get any more clarity on where we are on those talks. So again, Netanyahu on the defensive, defending Israel, defending his military's conduct of the war. To a lot of protests we'll get to in a second, but just while we're staying in the gallery, Rashida Tlaib, who's a representative from the Democrats, was there in the gallery. Many Democrats have boycotted this speech. She was holding a sign that said war criminal on one side and guilty of genocide on the other. And that gives you a sense of this charged atmosphere, Andrew.
And Ellen, as you've been speaking, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has finished his speech, and you're looking at live images there of Netanyahu meeting with lawmakers on the floor there of the U.S. Congress. Now, you mentioned that Netanyahu, in his speech, spent a lot of time denouncing the protests against Israel's actions, as you said, calling the protesters outside Iran's useful idiots. What can you tell us about what's been happening on the streets there?
Well, ever since this morning, thousands of protesters have been descending here on Washington, gathering around the Capitol, thousands of them. Just as the speech was beginning, they were approaching the Capitol area. The Capitol Police said they were using pepper spray on some of the protesters. Along with what's happening outside, dozens of Democratic lawmakers chose to boycott this address from Benjamin Netanyahu in anger over how Israel has conducted this war, just not wanting to be there, not wanting to give Netanyahu or the way this war has gone down any kind of endorsement. So an incredibly fraught atmosphere. You know, Kamala Harris, the vice president, normally the vice president would sit behind a foreign leader as they address a joint session of Congress. She is not doing that. Nancy Pelosi isn't there either. So again, an incredibly charged atmosphere, an incredibly divisive atmosphere. As you mentioned, Republicans inviting Netanyahu, Democratic leaders like Chuck Schumer only signing on to this visit rather reluctantly. There's some reporting that Chuck Schumer did not shake Netanyahu's hand. So again, incredibly fraught this visit, Andrew, as Netanyahu tries to defend Israel.
Ellen, thank you. That is the CBC's Ellen Morrow live in Washington.